Good evening. As you see on the board, we're in lesson 23, but we're just at the very end of it. We had covered everything but our questions last time. There is a new lesson 24. It's in the lobby. If you don't have that yet, we'll need that in a moment. And if you're online with us or watching the recording, it's on the church website. And so that'll be lesson 24 in a few minutes. So lesson 23, as we considered the Greek culture and Hellenistic Jews, the things that Daniel had prophesied of, the coming of the Greek kingdom, the impact of that on the Jewish folks. And so we saw the Greek rule, Greek culture, Greek language, and a Greek translation of the scripture. We saw that the Hellenistic world allowed Judaism to spread and in many ways thrive. But at the same time, there were challenges of being Hebrew in a Hellenistic world. And some of the same challenges we face today, being Christians as aliens and sojourners in a strange culture. So we talked about the effect of the Greeks as they came. We talked about the Hebrew, the Jewish diaspora, the scattering of the people. There were many Jews left in Babylon after the captivity there. Then there were many Jews all over the Hellenistic world, especially in Alexandria, where they made up maybe a quarter of the population. And basically everywhere in the Roman Empire, when we get to the book of Acts, that the gospel went. We found there was a Jewish synagogue there. There were people there who knew the law, both Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. And so between the Septuagint translation, putting the Bible into Greek for basically everybody who was literate at all to have access to God's Word, no matter what their background, that was an important thing. And then also the synagogues, where there was a weekly reading of Scripture and explanation of it, and the synagogues in so many ways presaging the church. Then we talked about the conflict that came, as we just mentioned a second ago, being Hebrew in the Hellenistic world. How much of this universal culture do you participate in? And we talked about people like Saul of Tarsus, who certainly was bilingual, probably more than two languages actually. But not only was he bilingual, I think there's no doubt that he was bicultural. He could swim in the Gentile world, in the Hellenistic world, just as readily as he could swim in the Hebrew world. And so he was able to drop quotes from relatively obscure poets into his sermons, if that was what's needed. And of course, he could drop quotation after quotation of the law. And so this did give, for the Jews who were in many places, it gave them access to this wider world, and they could be Jews in a synagogue in it. But at the same time, how much do you become like the world around you? And some obviously compromised too much. And there was conflict when it came to the Maccabean rebellion, which will be the subject of our next lesson. At times, there was basically civil war, where there were Jews fighting Jews because they would not keep the old ways, and they had become like the pagans round about. And we also mentioned briefly, as the last point there, with the synagogues, you would have these God-fearing Gentiles as well as Hellenistic Jews, basically all over the common culture and the common government area of the world. First the Greek empires, then the Roman Empire. Pretty much wherever the rule of Rome went, there was this Hellenistic culture. It's Latinized in some places, but in many ways, Greek culture even overwhelmed the Romans, but certainly Roman rule and authority overwhelmed the Greeks. And so in this monoculture that was everywhere from Spain to India and all the habitable portions around the Mediterranean Sea, north of the Sahara Desert and north of the deserts of Arabia and south of the inhospitable steppes of Asia, in that whole world, you could get along if you were familiar with Hellenistic culture. And many of the Jews were, and they went all over. And so they ended up seeding places repeatedly for the gospel to go. Okay, so that was our review of lesson 23. and let us look at our questions for Lesson 23, unless somebody has a question or comment before we leave behind the Greeks. So question 1 from the text. Why are we so sure that the Greeks are the ones that Daniel prophesied about as the third kingdom? We still have this four-kingdom motif that Daniel saw in Daniel 2 and in Daniel 7. Well, why are we so very sure that that third kingdom of the four, why are we so very sure that third kingdom is the Greeks? He just says it, exactly. In Daniel 8, it just says, after the Persians come the Greeks. This ram that you see in Daniel 8, Daniel just says that's the Greeks. So they fit the bill perfectly, but Daniel just says, or Daniel is told, pardon, and records for us, Daniel just says in the book, it's the Greeks, so there's no doubt. Question 2, why do we care so much about those Greeks? That's right. From Nehemiah, from the end of the Old Testament history to the beginning of the gospel history, we go from an Aramaic speaking people who are basically in two locations. A remnant who is in Judah in the Persian Empire speaking Aramaic, and another group of Jews, a large group of Jews in the former province of Babylon, now under the controls of the Persians. We have two groups of Jews there, and they speak Aramaic, and we start the Gospels, and where are their Jews? Well, in Judea and Galilee, and they're speaking mostly, or often, Greek. And the the Old Testament, that a lot of them are reading is Greek. The vast majority of quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament are from the Septuagint. There's a few of them from the Hebrew, but the vast majority of quotations are from the Septuagint. Then there's a couple of stray ones that come from Babylonian Targums, which are paraphrases of the Old Testament and other translations. But it's the New Testament world is one that swims in Greco-Roman culture. So we don't have any Greeks or Romans hardly. In the Old Testament history, we only have them in prophecy. But we have them for sure when we get to the New Testament, and it matters a lot. Question 3. What are some things that Hellenization brought to the Jewish world? We just mentioned the big one. It brought the language that the Jews would mostly speak. Not all the Jews and not all the time, but most of the Jews would speak Greek, and so did everybody else. And so we have a universal language. We think about today. Today, if you wanted to talk to everybody in the world, or everybody in an entire, an entire civilized region, what language would you speak? You want to talk to everybody. What language do you speak? English, if you're in this part of the world. But there's not really one to choose, is there? There's not really one to choose. Yes, James? Depends on what country. It depends a lot on what country. And so in the United Nations, for instance, which is one of the places where literally everybody gets together, how many basic languages does the UN have to put things in? They'll do things in just about anybody's language. But at the UN, there's basically 5 languages. There's 5 languages. How many of us can speak 5 languages? I'd be happy with one. But today, there isn't a universal language. Here, there's for this entire world, again, basically from the Atlantic Ocean to India, and the habitable regions between the deserts of North Africa and the steppes of Asia, for that massive swath of the world, one language would do you if you had Greek.
So the Hebrews, most of them spoke 2 languages then?
Yes.
So they did Aramaic and Greek?
Right.
Because Jesus kind of went back and forth.
Well, so the Gospels apparently are in Aramaic, and most scholars think Matthew may have been in Aramaic before he was even in Greek. You would have local people who did not, it wasn't every single person on every single street, but on every street there would be somebody who could do Greek. So it wasn't all of the old ladies, it wasn't all of the poor people, but everybody who participated in the wider culture. And so there would always be a handy interpreter nearby. And so, yes, there are some people who make it a point to keep the native language and to keep the native customs and the like. I remember when I was in Lithuania right after the wall fell, and they'd had, 40 years, or I guess it was more, some places 70 years of communism, some places it was 50 years of communism. There were a few people who made it a point to speak Russian badly, who lived in the Iron Curtain. There was a point of rebellion to not speak Russian to the Russian overlords. But other than a few, like holdouts like that, everybody could speak Russian. Everybody in the Eastern Bloc. And the Greek is kind of like that, except it didn't have to be forced, like English. You go anywhere today, you can find somebody just about that speaks English. And the reason is because there's such an economic advantage to it. There's such an advantage to it in participation in the culture of the world. You can get online and you can read and hear what people say. You can watch television. You can read books. There's just so many advantages to English that people all over the world just gravitate to it. The Greek was the same way, the Koine Greek, except that it had been the established thing like that in this entire world for 300 years. And so it was just Greek was everywhere, and anything that was not Greek was either, intentionally a holdout, like some of the Hebrews, or was just a backwater that didn't matter, or the like. So this common language and this common culture, and what this meant was that Jewish people were able to move everywhere. Everybody was able to move everywhere. And the Jewish people kept their cultural identity to a large degree, and so that's why you find these synagogues or Jewish quarters in city after city after city. You find these Jews would get to a place, and they'd find the other Jews, and you have an outpost of Judaism in place after place. How did Hellenism help the Jews? Or I just explained this one. How did the Hellenization help bring the Jews to the wider attention of the rest of the world? Well, here we have this unique, and they really were unique. And if anybody who had any education, anybody who had any knowledge, anybody who was interested in religious or philosophical things, knew that this was a monotheistic people. And they really, at that time, were pretty much the only ones. The only other ancient monotheistic religion that I can think of at all is Zoroastrianism from the old areas of Babylon. But that was always a minor thing. It still exists. It's been a minor footnote to religious and philosophical thought, ever since. But other than the Zoroastrians, nobody else was monotheistic. And you didn't have synagogues or the equivalent of whatever, a Zoroastrian meeting house was. You didn't have those in every city in the world. And so between the synagogues and the monotheism of the Jews, anybody who was interested knew who those people were and would know at least a little bit about them. And it was such an exceptional thing and such a well-known thing that under Roman law, they are the one people who had a religious exception that they could practice, their monotheism and not have to acknowledge the other gods, where everybody else did. When Christians didn't get that protection extended to them, it became one of the early reasons for persecution. How did Hellenistic culture conflict with observance of the law of Moses? Modesty. In the Bible, the thing about the body is use it properly for God, attire it, and adorn it modestly, and be faithful in marriage and seek for children. That's sort of the Hebrew view of the world and of the body. And how many of those things did the Hellenistic Jew, or the Hellenistic culture, how many of those things did Hellenism promote? Pretty much none of it. None of it. And so the worship of the body, of the physical form, the immodesty that went with the exercise program, the competition to excel in physical things. And we like sports, don't we? Yeah, well, so do the Greeks. The competitions and games, the rampant sexual immorality, all those things. It's a very different view of the use of the body than Hebrew culture. There was also no Sabbath in Hellenistic culture. What are all your, if you're in a business, what are all your competitors doing on Saturday? They're out there buying and selling and making gain and making contracts and making agreements and doing things. Aren't you going to fall behind if you don't do that? Now, in this country, once upon a time, based on such principles, we had our blue laws, right? How many of y'all are old enough to remember when you couldn't buy certain things on Sunday? Did they have that in Kansas, the Sunday laws? Just alcohol. But when I was growing up in Texas, so this would get us into the mid-'80s. In Texas, it was illegal to sell a huge raft of products on Sunday. There were large amounts of things, large amounts of trades you could not do on Sunday. And it was such that most stores were closed on Sunday. And back before we had Walmarts, so this is pre-Walmart days of, the Stegosauruses, no Walmarts, and other things like that. But in the pre-Walmart days, the little town I grew up in had a Gibson's discount center. And Gibson's didn't bother opening on Sunday because most of what they sold they couldn't sell anyway. And I remember when Gibson started opening on Sunday. And that change was made because you got to do trade 7 days a week. And does that seem to help people? I don't think it really does, but in any case, that kind of conflict. And so we had a lot of things in Hellenistic culture that conflicted with the religious devotion and religious practices of Jewish people. What institution was of great help to the Jews in knowing the law and staying together as a community? The synagogues. Right. And so we had a place to read the law, to get together and be a Jew. We had a place to go on the Sabbath, and we had an encouragement to stay with the teaching. And beside the Jewish people, who else was greatly helped by the synagogues? Besides the Jews. Who else was helped by synagogues? Yeah, well, the converts and the near converts, those God-fearing Gentiles. They didn't completely join the Jewish people. If you want to join the Jewish people, were you allowed to do that? You were. And there are several statements through the Old Testament about people who are not Jews joining up with the Jews. The first one I can think of is when they came out of Egypt. Who came out of Egypt with the Jews? It said there was this mixed multitude, the old King James says. There was this, some translations call it the rabble. There was all these people who, when the Jews left Egypt, what do you think a lot of other slaves did? A lot of other slaves said, I'm going with them. I don't know where they're going, but I'm going with them. And there was this large number of non-Jews who came out with the people. And when Moses, if you recall, during the time that they're in the wilderness, Moses takes a wife, right? Remember that story? Because it causes a little bit of friction in the family. His sister's not very happy about him marrying. I didn't mean that to be pun, because her name's Miriam. But Miriam is not happy about him marrying. And why does it say she wasn't happy with that? Cushite, yeah. And Cushite, there's two ways to translate that, Cushite, in the Old Testament. And what I don't like is some translations of the Bible in English do it both ways, which kind of just obscures the meaning. The other way to translate Cushite is Ethiopian. And so he married an Ethiopian woman while he's in the wilderness. Well, where'd that Ethiopian woman come from? Well, originally from Ethiopia, her family. But somehow she's out there in the wilderness with the people of God, right? So she's almost certainly, we're not exactly sure, she's quite likely one of these people that came out with them. And so when people would go join the Jews, and there's another statement of that in the book of Esther, toward the end of the book of Esther, when they defend themselves, and it's so obvious that God's with the Jews, it says a large number of people joined the Jews. So when either an individual or a family or a group of people go, you know, I like what y'all are doing here. I like this God you got. I like this law you got. This is a whole lot better than this, random paganism that we're suffering through, where God's throwing thunderbolts at us, and who knows what's going to happen. And especially some of the women, they didn't like the way that the pagan world treated them. And a lot of educated and powerful women joined the Jews. And so we like how, you respect your wives, and you want to have families and the like. Well, when people want to join up with the Jews, what do the Jews say? You're more than welcome. Come sit and learn. That was the normal procedure. And generally, they didn't go out and try to make converts. But what happens when converts show up? They let them come in. And sometimes the men would undergo circumcision. They would totally bind themselves to the law. They would be considered as Jews. There were others who had affinity for the Jews, but did not become circumcised. And so they were known as God-fearers. And I have seen in more recent historical scholarship mentioned that something maybe as high as 20% or slightly more of everybody in the Roman Empire was either a Jew or under the influence of Jewish teaching. Now that just seems really high and incredible, doesn't it? It almost seems like that's not possible. But when you look at how many synagogues there were around the world, when you look at some of the tablets and inscriptions at synagogues, and which local wealthy people are building synagogues. So the Jews didn't go build all these fancy synagogues themselves. A lot of times the locals built them for them, who had a great affinity for the Jews. So there is a sizable number of people who have an affinity for the Jews because of the law of God, because the Septuagint translation was available to the general population, that if you were a person who could read, you could read the book of God. And I have to say, I don't know how many of y'all have read very many things of ancient literature. Maybe in class you had to read some Cicero, or you had to read some segments of this or that. And I remember in some of my history classes reading a little bit of Suetonius, or reading a little bit of some other Roman historians. If you read those things, which that's the best of stuff that gets passed down to us even today. When you read that, and then you have a chance also to read the Old Testament in a language you can understand it, you can tell there's a difference here, right? These are not the same. These are not the same things. And so there was this massive body of people between the local synagogues and the ready availability, as readily available as any other ancient text. The ready availability of the Septuagint translation of the Scriptures in the language of the people made Judaism and the concepts related to the God of heaven a more known quantity than we probably ever suspect in the ancient world. All right, so that's Greek culture, Hellenistic Jews. All of this, I think, goes to Galatians 4:4. When did the Messiah come? In the fullness of time, when the time was fulfilled. I think this is a big part of it. So next lesson, 24. And again, if you don't have those, they're in the back in the lobby. Lesson 24, the Maccabean Revolt and an independent Jewish state. So we are now down to around the year 167 when this revolt gets started, 165, 164 when the revolt is done. We are now down to under 200 years between events and the coming of Jesus. And, even the ministry of Jesus. So Jesus is born, and again, this is part of the confusing thing. Jesus, we think, is born around 4 AD. I know different people have a few alternate timelines, which some think it's basically the year 0, because that's what they tried to set the calendar by, but most people think they missed it. Although some modern scholarship is saying, maybe those ancients didn't get as bad as we thought. Anyway, we are 165 or so years before the birth of Jesus. We are less than 200 years before Jesus appears on the heels of John the Baptist preaching the gospel. So we're getting in the same historical ballpark. So 200 years, we're no longer centuries and centuries removed from events that we know about in the New Testament. We're down on the 200. So again, we start with, let me just show you where we're at. We had the Greek culture. Now we have the Maccabean revolt in an independent state. We're going to have Romans and the Herods. So the Romans will end this independent state. Herod will get his power. And that's only, 40 years, 50 years before Jesus comes. And then we're going to have the wrapping all this up into setting up the New Testament world. So this independent Jewish state, we start with the great oppression and persecution that leads to the revolt. One of the worst rulers, certainly by Jewish reckoning of the ancient times, was this Antiochus IV, a ruler of the Seleucid dynasty from Damascus, whose family inheritance included ruling over Jerusalem. He treated the Jews terribly. Now, the worse he treated them, the more they gave him cause to be mad at him. And there was a couple of miscalculations on the Jews' part that enraged this unstable guy all the further. But all that leads to a generalized revolt. And you think about the whole history of the Old Testament. Of course, I understand that most of the time the Jews had rulers of their own. They had a Jewish family leading them. But how often do the Jews come up in armed revolt against their rulers? It's really not a feature of the Old Testament, is it? It's not Old Testament Judaism. How much do these people suffer under really bad rulers? And there's some independent, in the time of the judges, there's some independent actions and regional actions of fighting against them. And they fought against the Assyrians for a long time. But the Assyrians are taking over their kingdom up in northern Israel. But armed rebellion is not what the people are really known for. But this was a generalized armed rebellion that leads to self-rule. So the Jews end up with a period of self-rule. And they were quite successful militarily and materially for 50 or 60 years. The first half, things went real well. Second half, not so well. And eventually, they fall and they yield to Roman rule. And so the various claimees to the throne in Jerusalem of this new kingdom, the Romans show up to carve up the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, and the Roman envoy Pompey, he says, you know what, I think we'll just take Judea too. And some of the Jewish rulers, the ruling family, was fighting amongst themselves, and they decide, well, maybe we can get this guy on our side. And they both gave him great gifts and tribute. Turns out he was on his own side, and on the side of Rome, and he ends up taking the place lock, stock, and barrel. But the Jews had, before that, the Jews had a 100-year period of independence and self-rule. So the Maccabean revolt. Again, we turn to the pages of Daniel. We've done this multiple times. We'll note again that Daniel saw this coming. In Daniel 8, there's the prophecy that said the little horn would become great. and the regular burnt offerings would be taken away because of transgression. There was a vision concerning the regular burnt offering, that the transgression makes desolate, and a giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot, which was for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be restored. Now, Antiochus does, in his continual and escalating oppressions of the Jews, eventually do that very thing, and he stops the sacrifices, and the sacrifices in Jerusalem were put to a stop for about 3.5 years. So Daniel saw that in Daniel 8. In Daniel 11, there's a longer and more detailed prophecy about that contemptible one, depending on the translation, contemptible, despicable, or despised one, who would take the throne, and mentions all the terrible things he would do. And there's constant turmoil and war surrounding him. He got the throne in turmoil. He was constantly fighting with both people in his own kingdom and with those Greek rulers down in Egypt, the Ptolemy family. And on one occasion, the report came back to Jerusalem that he had been killed by the Ptolemies down in Egypt. They have a big premature celebration celebrating his death and declaring independence. And then he comes riding back home to Damascus, and he's not dead yet, and what does he do? He persecutes them, and he oppresses them all the more, especially since they rejoiced at his death, which, as Mark Twain once said, he said, the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. And so he wasn't terribly happy about that. But the scripture says, and we'll just read a little bit of Daniel 11, he would appear and profane the temple and fortress. He will take away the regular burnt offering, and they will set up the abomination which makes desolate. And so Daniel had prophesied these things, and these things come to pass. The hardships and the continual oppressions, and they just push people, and finally until they break. Now, the ironic thing about him pushing people was an awful lot of the Jews in and around Jerusalem, including the guy who had been the high priest, they had gone along with Hellenization. They weren't fighting any of the cultural things that he was doing. And when he told them, you can't circumcise your kids, and you can't keep the Sabbath, and you can't do this, and you can't do that, and you can't do all these things of the law, an awful lot of Jews had acquiesced and go, well, we didn't kind of like that law anyway. They weren't bothered by it. But he pressed them, and instead of just leaving it at that, he actually outlawed it entirely. So anybody who had a remnant of wanting to keep the law, now they got their dander up. And so they just pushed and pushed these things until finally somebody very publicly said, no more, that's it. And so if you have your guide, study guide, we have a couple, and we'll save a discussion of these books to next week, but we have a couple of short excerpts from the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And this is a record of what he did from 1st Maccabees, the first chapter. After Antiochus defeated Egypt in the 143rd year, which corresponds to 169 BC, he returned and went up against Israel and against Jerusalem with a strong force. He insolently entered the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for the light of its utensils, the offering table, the cups and bowls, the golden censer, and the curtain. So he took away, he just basically stole out of the temple all the important pieces of furniture. The cornices and the golden ornament of the facade of the temple, he stripped it all off. And he took away the silver and gold of the precious vessels. He also took all the hidden treasures he could find. Taking all this, he went back to his own country. He shed much blood, and he spoke with great arrogance. And so that's just about as thorough a persecution and oppression as possible. A little bit later in the same chapter of 1st Maccabees. The king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow the customs foreign to their land, to prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbath and feast days, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers, to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, and to sacrifice swine and unclean animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to defile themselves with every kind of impurity and abomination, so they might forget the law and change all of its ordinances. Whoever refused to act in command of the king was to be put to death. So, again, that's a contemporary account from 1 Maccabees. I might just say a little bit about 1 Maccabees and 2nd before we quit. These books, they don't come down to us in the original Aramaic, but they are in the Septuagint translation. And so we know that they are from long before the time of Christ, at least 150 years. These are thought to be contemporaneous accounts of these events. Now, we don't hold these books to be inspired, but we do hold them to be reliable histories. And so when you have it, when it's from the ancient world, when you have a widely spread book that tells plausible stories, we give it the benefit of the doubt and say, right, that's a good account. And so that's how we're going to hold 1st and 2nd Maccabees. We'll use them a little bit just to give the details of what the Jewish people went through, but it's recorded that they suffered. And it's recorded that, and this will be where we start next week, that his petty officials were off in the small towns and telling people they had to offer these sacrifices to idols. And an old priest named Matthias stood up and said, we're not going to do it. And then a local Jewish fellow started carrying up the profane sacrifice to the altar that had been built for the priest, led by Matthias, to offer the sacrifice on. And Matthias was so enraged that he killed the fellow. And then he killed the officials who were sent out there to make sure it was done. And then he said, we've basically, paraphrasing, we've had enough of this. Anybody who's with God, come to the hills with me. And thus starts the revolt of the Maccabees. And so the Maccabean rebellion or Maccabean revolt starts when they just push this paganism so much that the people can't stand it anymore, and it leads to a general rebellion and uprising. And, as we say, it's a very successful one because for 100 years, they end up with their own kingdom. All right, so that'll be next time as we continue.